Rain needles the ridge, thunder rolls like drums, and my steel gate newly welded legally, mine glints under the storm lights. That's when Karen arrives, flanked by a U-Haul and a sermon about community tradition demanding I open up so her parents can reclaim their place. She waves printer paper bylaws like a holy text. I hold the deed, the survey, and a key that says otherwise. The creek below is swelling, the sheriff's SUV idles behind her, and the camera on my post blinks red, recording every trembling word. 2 months ago, this old mountain house was a quiet rescue mission. Tonight, it's a siege. She calls me heartless. I call it boundary setting. What she doesn't know is I've mapped every angle, paper trails, timestamps, a road that belongs to one name only mine, and when lightning splits the trees, her empire of entitlement starts to melt like wet ink. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? When I first found the house, it didn't feel like a house at all. It looked more like a forgotten relic of the mountain sagging rooflines, windows boarded up with warped plywood moss, climbing the stone chimney like ivy, reclaiming a castle. The kind of place you'd expect to find in a ghost story or maybe as the last outpost of someone who'd wanted to disappear. I hadn't been looking for perfection, though. I was looking for something raw, hidden a place I could carve into my own. And when I saw that crooked for sale by owner sign nailed to a tree at the end of a rutted road, my heart thumped like I'd just struck gold. The seller was an old logger named McCarthy. His handshake was leathery, his eyes distant, as if he'd seen the mountain take more men than it gave back. He didn't sugarcoat anything. Roof leaks, pipes busted. You'll haul more rot out than you'll ever keep, he said. But then he handed me a folder yellow deed surveys from the 1952nd, a signed affidavit from a county surveyor declaring the road private maintained solely by the landowner at the top. He tapped that page with a calloused finger. That road's yours, son. Always has been. No one else gets through without your say. Those words carried a weight I didn't fully appreciate at the time. I thought it just meant I'd have privacy. Freedom. No nosy neighbors telling me how high my grass should be. I didn't yet know how entitlement could crawl under someone's skin, twist itself into rights, and turn a simple road into a battlefield. I bought the place cash. No mortgage, no bank breathing down my neck. Just me, a rented pickup, and a dream of early mornings with coffee on the porch, fog curling through the pines. The first drive up as the new owner, I remember thinking the silence was almost holy. No traffic, no sirens, just the crunch of gravel under my tires. And then, like a bad omen, there she was. Karen. She stood at the bend of the road like a self-appointed traffic cop, clipboard in hand, a fluorescent vest thrown over her cardigan as though she were guarding the Pentagon. She flagged me down with a practiced air of authority. "You can't just drive up here," she said, not even waiting for me to roll my window down. Her voice had that nasal twang of someone who had spent years lecturing waiters, clerks, and apparently new homeowners. "This is a community-maintained road. We have rules. We vote on renovations. We vote on who can stay overnight. We vote on—" I held up the deed against the glass. "I own the last parcel. The road leads to my property." She leaned down, squinting, then snorted like a horse. "That might be true on paper, but the last owner always let my parents stay there whenever they needed. It's tradition." I remember blinking at her rain, still drying on the windshield, and thinking, what kind of tradition involves squatting on someone else's land? "Nice to meet you," I said, shifting the truck back into gear. "But traditions don't override deeds." Her smile tightened, the kind of expression that told me I had just declared war without realizing it. I drove on, shaking my head, telling myself she was eccentric, maybe even lonely. Surely this was just one of those quirks of mountain living you laugh about later. But by the second week, I knew better. Every load of lumber I hauled up the ridge, there she was, phone out recording, muttering about permits. When contractors arrived, she intercepted them at the bottom, hissing warnings about ongoing litigation. I found handwritten notes under my windshield wipers. "Quiet hours are 8 p.m. Your woodpile is unsafe. Landscape must be harmonious." At first I brushed it off, let her play sheriff of nowhere. But then she started stepping onto the property itself, wandering the porch like she was inspecting for violations, claiming the guest house out back had been community shelter decades ago. That was the moment my patience cracked. I dug back through McCarthy's folder, flipping past faded maps, until I found a letter from a licensed surveyor dated 30 years ago, certifying the road and gate as private. Not just private, but exclusive to the property owner at the top. That meant me. The HOA she claimed to lead, not mentioned anywhere. The supposed community rights, a fantasy scribbled on printer paper. Still, fantasies have power when wielded by someone like Karen. She didn't need truth, she needed persistence. And persistence she had in spades. That night, under the glow of a lantern in the half-rotted kitchen, I started a notebook. Every encounter, every time she appeared, every complaint filed. Dates, times, exact quotes. My lawyer in town had warned me, don't lose your cool, don't escalate, document, document, document. So I did. Meanwhile, I swung a hammer until my hands blistered, patching walls, cutting back trees, scraping decades of grime from the bones of the house. With every nail driven, the place seemed to breathe again. I replaced the busted windows and sunlight streamed through for the first time in years, scattering dust motes like gold in the air. For a brief stretch, it felt like maybe I could ignore her, drown her pettiness in the rhythm of work. But then she escalated. She started telling me, not asking, that her parents would be moving in. First, it was framed as casual. They love the mountain air. Just for a weekend. Then it became urgent. They lost their apartment. It's only fair they stay in the guest house. When I refused, she gave me that thin smile again and said, well, the association will decide. There was no association. But the way she said it, you'd think she had Congress in her pocket. By week 3, I realized this wasn't eccentricity. This was obsession. The sheriff would later tell me he'd seen this pattern before, people who blur the line between entitlement and reality, who convince themselves that wanting something hard enough makes it theirs. At the time, though, all I saw was a woman with too much time and too little restraint standing between me and the peace I had bought. So I welded a new lock on the gate, installed cameras, drew a line. The mountain was supposed to be my refuge. Instead, it was becoming a battlefield, and Karen was just gearing up for her siege. The first time I saw her fake HOA violation notice taped to my truck window, I nearly laughed. It was printed on plain copy paper with a Clippert logo that looked like it had been stolen from a gardening magazine. The heading read, Mountain View Community Association, Official Warning. And beneath it in bold, she had written, Unapproved renovations. Cease immediately or face fines. There was no address, no signature, nothing remotely legal. Just Karen's idea of authority flapping in the mountain breeze like a flag of delusion. But here's the thing about people like her, it's never about whether it makes sense. It's about repetition. About creating so much noise, so many paper trails that someone less stubborn than me would eventually fold. She was counting on me being too tired to push back. Instead, I started collecting. Every note, every official letter, every voicemail she left hissing about bylaws that didn't exist, I filed them into a growing binder. I nicknamed the HOA Chronicles. By the end of the month, that binder was already an inch thick. She tried every angle. If she wasn't leaving fake citations on my windshield, she was intercepting my contractors, demanding they show her building permits. One of my electricians, a man who'd worked in 3 counties, told me she stood in front of his van for 15 minutes with her arms crossed like a schoolteacher until he finally threatened to call the sheriff. Delivery trucks fared no better. The UPS guy said she told him the road was about to be condemned and he should stop bringing packages up. When he laughed, she called his supervisor. To his credit, the supervisor called me afterward and apologized, saying, "We've dealt with her before. Don't worry, we'll keep delivering." Still, the harassment was relentless. Every day brought a new stunt, and every day I hammered nails into old beams, patched drywall, and reminded myself why I was here. But ignoring her wasn't enough. She wanted escalation, and she was determined to get it. The moment I knew this wasn't just about harassment came when she stepped onto the porch, uninvited, clipboard in hand, and began snapping photos of the interior through the broken front door. I was inside, crouched on the floor, ripping up rotten boards when I heard the click of her camera. I stood, saw her through the slats, and opened the door. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I asked. She didn't even flinch. "Documenting unsafe conditions. The association has concerns about structural integrity." I pointed to the deed hanging in a frame on the wall, the one I'd mounted like a trophy to remind myself this place was mine. "This is private property. The only condition you need to worry about is how quickly you get off my land." She sniffed, scribbled something on her paper, and muttered, "We'll see about that." That night, I dug deeper into McCarthy's old files. And that's when I struck gold. Buried in the back was a notarized survey map from 30 years ago. On it, the boundary lines were drawn thick, every corner marked, and in bold letters, across the bottom, private road access, limited to parcel owner at Ridge Summit. There it was. Proof so clear, even Karen's fantasy court couldn't ignore it. The road, the gate. Every square foot belonged to me. No easements, no communal rights, just mine. The next morning I bought a reinforced padlock, welded a new bracket to the gate, and posted a sign in reflective red letters, "No trespassing." Private road. Violators will be prosecuted. I taped a polite but firm note to the post. All access restricted to property owner. Please direct inquiries to county clerk for confirmation. And then I waited. Karen's response wasn't silence, it was escalation. 2 days later, a county inspector drove up. He was young, clipboard in hand, and looked apologetic before he even stepped out of his truck. Got a complaint, he said. Unsafe worksite, possible code violations. I walked him through the house, showed him the new supports, the permits for electrical rewiring, the reinforced chimney. He nodded, scribbled notes, then chuckled. Yeah, I figured. She does this every month to someone. I'll file a clean report. As he drove off, I stood in the driveway watching his taillights vanish through the pines, and I realized Karen wasn't just annoying. She was dangerous, in the way only delusional people can be. She believed she was right no matter how many documents said otherwise. And belief like that, it's harder to fight than facts. I doubled down. Every supply run to town, I stopped at the clerk's office, pulled every record, made photocopies of deeds, surveys, affidavits. I hired a lawyer named Hartley, a gray-haired bulldog with a reputation for chewing up frivolous lawsuits before they even hit the docket. He looked over my stack of documents, leaned back in his chair, and said, "Son, you've got an iron wall here. Just keep it all documented. If she pushes harder, we'll slam the door on her." So I did. Meanwhile, I fortified the property, welded crossbars into the gate, installed solar-powered cameras along the road, bought motion lights that flicked on like stadium lamps when a car crept too close. My weekends became a blend of renovation and defense, as though I were building a cabin and a fortress all at once. But for all my preparation, Karen had one weapon I hadn't counted on, persistence laced with audacity. She didn't back down. Instead, she began weaving her parents into every conversation. "My parents love that mountain air," she said one morning, appearing at the gate as I carried lumber from the truck. "It would be a shame to deny them that." Another time, she left a note on my windshield. "It's only for a month until they find something permanent." The implication was clear. If I didn't agree, she'd keep pressing until she forced the issue. When I confronted her, she gave me that tight smile again. "Well, the association will decide." "The association doesn't exist," I shot back. She just shrugged like I'd missed the point entirely. That night, sitting by the fire with rain dripping through the patched roof, I wrote it all down. Every note, every word. Because something in me knew this wasn't the end. This was just her opening act. And I was determined to be ready for the main event. The mountain was quiet, yes. But beneath that silence, a storm was brewing, and Karen was the kind of woman who mistook thunder for applause. By the third month, the battle lines were no longer invisible. They were carved into the mountain itself. My side, a deed thicker than a Bible, a gate bolted like a fortress, and the kind of stubborn patience that only comes from swinging a hammer 12 hours a day. Karen's side rumors, complaints, and a crusade to turn her personal obsession into community tradition. It all came to a head the morning she marched up the road with 2 strangers in tow. I was up on scaffolding hammering joists into the guest house roof when I saw her car stop at the bend. Out stepped Karen in her signature vest, and behind her 2 men in polo shirts with clipboards. She strutted up the driveway like she owned the place, waving her hands toward the guest house. "These are inspectors," she announced, her voice pitched so the whole forest could hear. "They're here to verify the property is safe for occupancy." I climbed down, sweat dripping off my face, and looked them over. No badges, no county insignias, just plain clipboards. "Let me guess," I said. "Friends of yours." One of the men shuffled his feet. The other mumbled something about volunteering with the lodge. "That's what I thought," I said, pulling out my phone. "You've got 10 seconds to leave before I call the real sheriff." For the first time, Karen faltered. Her jaw worked, but no words came out. She spun on her heel, muttering about community rights, and the 3 of them retreated like kids caught egging a house. That night, I wrote the incident into my notebook, every detail, time, names, license plates. My lawyer later told me it was gold evidence of attempted impersonation, harassment, trespass. But to me, it just felt exhausting. She wasn't slowing down. She was getting creative. The next tactic was guilt. She began dropping hints, loud ones, about her parents losing their apartment in town, how they'd always loved staying up here on the ridge, how the guest house was basically theirs already. I said no. First gently, then firmly. But Karen had a way of twisting no into fuel. One morning she called up from the gate while I was mixing concrete. "You've got a moral obligation, you know. My parents are elderly. What kind of man denies shelter to the elderly?" I walked down, boots crunching on gravel, and met her eye. "The kind of man who owns the land," I said flatly. "Your parents are not my responsibility." Her smile thinned into a blade. "Well, the association will decide." That phrase had become her anthem. She said it like it carried the force of law, as if her imaginary HOA was some kind of shadow government waiting in the wings. I almost laughed, but the malice in her eyes killed the humor. Not a week later, a letter arrived in the mail. It was addressed not just to me, but to property owner Ridge Summit Parcel. Inside was a printed petition Karen had filed, claiming the guest house was historically a community storm shelter and should remain available for public use in emergencies. Attached were a handful of signatures, neighbors from the valley below, who had probably signed just to get her out of their kitchens. I took the whole packet straight to my lawyer. Hartley flipped through it, snorted, and said, "This won't last 5 minutes, but it shows intent. She's trying to establish precedent." He drafted a formal rebuttal the same day, citing the survey, the deed, the private road certification. By the time the petition reached the county board, it was already dead on arrival. But Karen didn't stop. She started harassing my suppliers, called the lumberyard, pretending to be my project manager, and canceled a delivery. The clerk thankfully smelled the lie and phoned me before unloading the order. When I confronted her at the gate, she shrugged like it was a misunderstanding. "We thought you were building a resort," she said slyly. "The community has a right to know." Her definition of community, I realized, was just her, and whatever voices echoed in her head. That's when I decided defense wasn't enough. I had to go on offense, not with rage, not with confrontation, but with documentation, so airtight it would choke her crusade before it took root. I doubled the cameras, bought a trail cam for the back path in case she tried sneaking around through the woods, installed motion sensors along the fence line. I even wired a backup battery into the gate lock so a storm couldn't cut the power. If she wanted a siege, she'd be facing something closer to a fortress. And still she kept pressing her parents into the narrative. She left voicemails late at night. "We'll be up Friday to get them settled." She mailed me old photographs of her family picnicking by the creek as if nostalgia equaled ownership. She even drafted a fake tenancy agreement, unsigned but with her parents' names scrawled at the bottom. I laughed when I read it, then filed it into the HOA Chronicles. But beneath the humor, I felt a chill. She wasn't just bluffing anymore, she was preparing. The Sheriff Daniels dropped by one evening while on patrol. He leaned against his SUV hat, tilted low, and said, "She's been in my office again. Claims you're committing elder abuse by refusing her parents' shelter." I rubbed a hand over my face. "You've got to be kidding me." He shook his head. "Nope. Listen, keep doing what you're doing. Document everything. She's building a narrative, but the law's on your side. Don't take the bait." That advice stuck with me. Don't take the bait. So I didn't. I kept working, sanding floors, painting walls, wiring the guest house. Every nail I drove felt like a stake in the ground, a reminder that this was mine, not hers. Yet every step forward also deepened the tension. The mountain itself seemed to hum with it, as if even the trees were waiting for the next clash. I began walking the property line each evening with a flashlight, checking every stake, every blaze mark. I wanted no room for confusion, legal or otherwise. The mountain was clear this was my land. But clarity doesn't stop obsession. One night, headlights flickered at the bend in the road. I cut my drill, stepped onto the porch, and watched. Karen sat there for nearly 20 minutes, engine idling, phone camera pointed at the gate. She didn't get out. She didn't shout. She just stared. When she finally backed down the hill, a knot settled in my stomach. This wasn't harassment anymore. It was reconnaissance. The next morning, as I checked the cameras, the unease solidified. On one feed, I caught her pacing at the gate with a tape measure, jotting notes in a little book, measuring the posts, measuring the lock, like a burglar planning a break-in. I saved the footage to 3 different drives, uploaded it to the cloud, and sent a copy to Hartley. His reply was immediate. "She's escalating. Stay alert." By then, I knew something was coming. The way she wove her parents deeper into the story, the way she measured the lock, the way she lingered at the bend, it was all building to one inevitable scene. Karen wasn't going to ask permission anymore. She was going to force the issue. And when she did, I intended to be ready. Because this wasn't just about a guest house or a patch of mountain air. This was about boundaries, the kind you draw in steel and stone, and the kind you defend with patience sharper than any blade. The siege wasn't over. In fact, it hadn't even truly begun. By midsummer, the mountain was alive with the sounds of progress hammers, striking saws buzzing, and the rhythmic thud of my boots across the porch boards as I rebuilt what decades of neglect had nearly destroyed. The house was coming back to life. But for every nail I drove into the frame, Karen found a new way to wedge herself into my day. She wasn't just a nuisance anymore, she was an active campaign. The first real wave hit through paperwork. I went into town to pick up paint, and the clerk at the hardware store chuckled as he slid my order across the counter. "Hey," he said, "that neighbor of yours called last week pretending to be your contractor. Tried to cancel half this order." His grin faltered when he saw my face harden. "Don't worry," he added quickly. "I smelled the rat. Didn't touch your file." But it wasn't just one store. The lumberyard said she'd tried the same stunt. The delivery company, too. Everywhere I went, people shook their heads, muttering that she had too much time on her hands. The problem was time wasn't her only weapon, audacity was. She started circulating flyers in town, accusing me of planning to turn the mountain into a private resort. One evening at the diner, a man approached my booth and asked if it was true. I pulled out a copy of my deed, slid it across the table, and showed him my renovation sketches. His eyebrows shot up. "She's got an imagination, I'll give her that," he said, shaking his head. Word spread quickly, and more than a few locals began to see through her act. Still, Karen wasn't aiming for truth. She was aiming for doubt. The county clerk by now, a half-friend, half-co-conspirator in this saga, called me one afternoon. "She filed another petition," he said with weary amusement. "This time she's trying to designate your guest house as a historic emergency shelter. Claims it was used during storms in the 1,980 seconds. He sighed. No documentation, of course. Just her word, and a couple of signatures she probably begged from people who wanted her out of their driveway. I could almost picture her at her kitchen table, drawing maps, drafting bylaws, convincing herself she was fighting some noble battle. And maybe she even believed it. But belief doesn't make it true. Meanwhile, I fortified my side of the fight. Every interaction with her went straight into the Karen Chronicles. Every false claim, every call, every flyer documented, time-stamped, backed up to the cloud. My lawyer said it was exactly the kind of thoroughness judges like to see. If this goes to court, he told me, you won't just win, you'll bury her. But Karen wasn't slowing down. If anything, she was escalating. Contractors I hired told me she cornered them at the bottom of the hill, warning them I was under investigation. One even brought me a recording of her rant. Her voice was shrill, cutting through the mountain air like broken glass. "He doesn't belong here, he's a squatter. My parents are supposed to live there." The contractor and I laughed when we played it back, but beneath the humor a chill lingered. It wasn't just persistence. It was obsession bordering on mania. And then came the personal touches. One morning I walked down to the gate and found a wicker basket resting against the post. Inside were apples slightly bruised with a handwritten note. A peace offering. "Let's work together for the good of the community." The word community was underlined 3 times. I left the basket where it was. By nightfall, raccoons had taken care of it. The next week, it was a handwritten poem taped directly to the lock. "This mountain binds us history entwined. Don't let cold law erase what's mine." I burned that one in the fire pit. But these softer gestures didn't fool me. They were just another tactic, another way to wedge her narrative into the cracks of reality. The sheriff confirmed as much. Daniel stopped by one evening, parking his SUV at the base of my drive. He leaned against the hood, arms crossed, watching the sunset bleed over the ridge. "She's been back in my office," he said, "this time claiming you threatened her with a firearm." I stared at him in disbelief. "The only thing in my hand is a hammer." He nodded. I figured. "Don't worry, I logged it as another harassment complaint. But listen, she's building a case, hoping you'll snap, maybe even throw a punch, so she can flip the narrative. Don't give her that." That warning stuck with me. Each time I saw her car idling at the bend phone camera raised, I forced myself to breathe, to stay calm, to let the cameras do the talking for me. Rage was exactly what she wanted, and rage was the one thing I refused to give her. Still, her fixation on her parents was intensifying. She left voicemails saying, "We'll be up Friday to move them in." She sent an email declaring, "Consider this, your notice, we're reclaiming our space." It was delusion turned into paperwork. I reinforced the guest house door with a deadbolt. Moved my tools inside so it wouldn't sit empty. Installed another camera on the trail leading down to the creek just in case she tried sneaking her parents up the back way. My fortress was nearly complete, part renovation project, part siege defense. But in the quiet moments, sitting on the porch at dusk, watching fog roll down the ridge, I couldn't shake the thought of her parents. Pale faces peering out from the cab of a truck, bewildered, manipulated into believing they had some ancestral claim here. They weren't the villains in this story. They were pawns. And Karen was moving them across the board with reckless confidence. I felt a twinge of pity for them, but pity wasn't going to stop what was coming. Because deep down I knew the storm wasn't just a metaphor anymore. A real storm was brewing on the horizon, dark clouds gathering over the ridge, winds shaking the trees. And Karen was the type to see thunder as her cue, lightning as her spotlight. She wasn't done. not by a long shot. The mountain was quiet, yes, but it was the kind of quiet that comes before a landslide, the hush before everything breaks loose. And I had no illusions when she made her next move it wouldn't be another flyer or a fake inspector or a basket of apples. It would be something bigger, louder, harder to ignore. And when that moment came, I promised myself I'd be ready. The storm that finally brought everything to a head didn't roll in gently. It roared up the valley like an invading army, black clouds spilling over the ridge, thunder hammering the air so hard the windows rattled in their frames. By late afternoon, the creek below had swollen into a frothing torrent, snapping branches and carrying logs downstream. I was on the porch securing the shutters when my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the gate camera. At first, I thought it was just the wind shaking branches across the sensor, but then I saw the headlights. One set, then another, then the high box shape of a U-Haul truck lumbering up the road, tires already sliding in the mud. Behind it, another car followed, close brake lights flaring red against the rain. Even through the grainy feed, I felt my stomach tighten. Karen. I grabbed my rain jacket, slipped my phone into a waterproof pouch, and started down the drive. Every step squelched in the rising water, the storm pounding harder with each minute. By the time I reached the gate, the convoy had already arrived. The U-Haul angled across the road, wheels spinning uselessly, its driver shouting curses through the storm. Behind it, Karen's sedan sat with hazard lights flashing, and in the back seat of the trailing car, two pale faces pressed against the glass, her parents. Karen herself was already out of her car, soaked through hair, plastered to her forehead. She shouted over the storm, her voice shrill, riding on the thunder. "Open the gate, this is an emergency." The lock gleamed under the rain steel and immovable. I stepped closer, the key dangling from my hand, calm despite the chaos. "This is private property," I said, raising my voice, so the storm wouldn't swallow it. "You've been told. You've been warned. Turn around." Her parents peered from the car, confusion etched into their faces. They looked more frightened than entitled, and for a flicker of a second I almost pitied them. But then Karen shrieked again, her words cutting through pity like a blade. "You can't keep family out of their home, this is our right." Before I could answer, headlights swept the scene from behind. An SUV rolled up steady against the rain. The sheriff. Daniel stepped out, pulling his hood up the flashing bar, painting the trees in frantic red and blue. He didn't even look surprised, just weary, as if he'd known this circus was coming all along. Karen spun toward him, flailing her arms. "Sheriff, you have to make him open it, my parents." Daniels held up a hand, his voice calm but firm. "Karen, you know the law. This is his property. You're trespassing." The words hit like another clap of thunder, but Karen didn't yield. She pointed at the U-Haul, at her parents, at the rising creek. "They'll die out here. You can't just let them drown in a storm." I stepped forward, rain streaming down my face. "There's a shelter 15 minutes down the mountain, heated, stocked, safe. If you care about them, you'll take them there." Her parents stirred at that, the older man cracking his window to shout something muffled but urgent. Karen ignored him. She was locked in her own narrative, and nothing, not the law, not the weather, not her parents' own voices, was going to shake it loose. "You stole this mountain," she screamed at me. "You think a piece of paper makes it yours. This is family land." The sheriff's eyes flicked to mine, then back to her. His voice stayed steady. "Karen, I'm giving you one last chance. Move the truck, get your parents to safety, or I'll write you up for endangerment." The U-Haul driver, clearly fed up with being caught in someone else's drama, threw up his hands. "Lady, I'm not risking my rig for this. Either we back it down now, or you're on your own." He climbed back into the cab, revving the engine, as the tires spun deeper into the mud. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the entire scene for a frozen instant. The U-Haul cocked sideways, Karen's face twisted in rage, her parents' wide, bewildered eyes, the sheriff's hand resting on his radio. It looked less like a neighborhood dispute, and more like a painting of human folly at the gates of a fortress. The rain thickened, coming down in sheets. The U-Haul lurched, spun, then slid a foot toward the ditch. Karen's parents began shouting from the car, panic cutting through the roar of the storm. They weren't buying her story anymore, they were scared. Daniels moved closer, his voice low but cutting through. "Karen, that's enough. Get your parents out of here." For the first time, I saw hesitation flicker across her face. The storm, the sheriff, the mud, it was all pressing in, dissolving the empire of paper and lies she'd built. Her parents were pleading now, their hands slapping the inside of the windows, demanding to leave. I lifted the lock once more, snapped it shut with a loud clang, and let the key dangle in my hand. A sound louder than her, shouting louder even than the thunder, a statement carved into steel. "This ends here," I said. Her parents' car backed up, first tires sliding but finding traction as it turned slowly down the hill. The U-Haul driver cursed, shifted into reverse, and began the long, nerve-wracking retreat down the flooded road. Karen lingered, standing in the rain, hair plastered, screaming into the night that this wasn't over. But the sheriff's hand on her shoulder was enough to turn her toward her car. I stood there until the last set of taillights vanished into the mist. The rain hammered down, thunder cracked overhead, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. The gate had held, the law had held, and Karen's empire of entitlement had crumbled in the mud and the rain. I walked back up the drive, soaked to the bone, adrenaline buzzing through my veins. The house loomed ahead, its new windows glowing faintly through the storm, a beacon against the chaos. For months I had built it board by board, nail by nail. Tonight I realized it wasn't just a house anymore. It was a statement. This land was mine, and no storm, whether made of weather or of Karen's delusions, was going to take it away. When the sheriff's taillights disappeared into the rain-slicked valley, I stood at the gate for a long moment, letting the storm soak me through. My heart was still hammering, but beneath the adrenaline was something new, a strange, quiet certainty. The line had held. The gate, the law, the truth, all of it had stood firm against her most brazen attempt yet. And though my clothes clung heavy with water, I felt lighter than I had in months. The creek below raged like a living thing, roaring its approval, carrying branches and debris downstream as if to wash away the last remnants of Karen's siege. Her parents' terrified faces lingered in my mind. They weren't villains, they were casualties of her obsession, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of pity. They had believed her story right up until the storm itself shattered it. Maybe now they'd start asking questions she couldn't answer. I trudged back up the hill, boots sinking into the mud, and when I reached the porch, the mountain house looked different to me. Not just lumber and nails anymore. It had become a fortress, yes, but also a statement: boundaries matter, and they hold only if you're willing to stand your ground, no matter how wild the storm. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving the mountain draped in mist. Pine needles glittered with rain, the air thick with the scent of wet earth. I poured coffee, sat on the porch, and replayed the footage from the night before. The cameras had caught it all, the U-Haul stuck at an angle, Karen's shrieking face lit by lightning, her parents shouting from the car, the sheriff's steady presence. It was absurd and tragic all at once. Proof, though, irrefutable proof. I uploaded the files to cloud storage and sent copies to my lawyer. Hartley called me an hour later. "That's gold," he said. "If she tries anything else, this footage ends the conversation. Judges don't like theatrics, and you've got her entire circus recorded in HD." I almost laughed. Almost. Because I knew Karen too well by now. People like her don't retreat gracefully. They regroup. And I was right. Within a week, another letter arrived. This time it wasn't hand-scrawled HOA notices or printer paper bylaws. It was an official filing, Karen petitioning the court to grant her temporary emergency occupancy of the guest house on behalf of her parents. The gall of it made me laugh out loud, but Hartley's voice was serious when I called. "Don't underestimate this. It's flimsy, yes, but the fact she went to court means she's escalating from harassment to legal warfare. We'll counterfile with your evidence and the sheriff's report. It won't hold up, but it's another round you'll need to fight." So I gathered everything: the deed, the survey, the affidavit, the inspector's reports, the video footage. By the time we were done, the binder of evidence had swollen thick as a dictionary. If Karen wanted war in court, she was going to choke on paper. Meanwhile, life on the mountain didn't pause. I kept building. Sanded the new porch rails until they gleamed, finished wiring the guest house, every outlet tested and working, hung curtains in the main house for the first time, softening the edges of the fortress I'd created. With every project completed, the house transformed from survival to home. But Karen wasn't done trying to claw her way in. She shifted tactics again, leaning on guilt and manipulation. She left voicemails in a trembling voice. "You don't understand what this mountain means to my parents. They're fragile. You're destroying them." She mailed me old family photos, her parents as children sitting by a creek that might have been mine, might have been anywhere in the county. Scrawled on the back, "This proves it's ours." It didn't, but it proved how far gone she was. Sheriff Daniels called one evening. "She's filed another complaint, elder abuse, claiming you denied shelter in life-threatening conditions." I clenched my jaw. She dragged her parents into a storm. I offered them directions to shelter. "That's all on video." "I know," Daniels said. "Judge dismissed it already, but you should know she's getting more erratic. Keep steady. Don't let her bait you." That had become his refrain: "Don't take the bait." And every time it got harder, because the truth was I was tired. Tired of documenting, tired of guarding, tired of turning what should have been a peaceful renovation into siege warfare. At night, I sat by the fire listening to the mountain settle and wondered if it was worth it. Selling crossed my mind. Walking away. But then I'd remember the first time I saw the house, the moss-covered sign, the silence of the ridge, the way the place had called to me like it had been waiting. This was mine, bought, paid for, built with my sweat, and no storm of entitlement was going to push me off. The community slowly began to see it too. Contractors who had once hesitated to work for me now joked about Karen patrols when they dropped off supplies. The hardware store clerk started greeting me with, "Still holding the ridge, huh?" Even the mail carrier, once nervous about delivering up here, told me flatly, "We don't listen to her anymore. You're the owner. End of story." Karen, of course, didn't see it that way. She sent another barrage of letters this time, not from herself, but from advocates for senior housing, all parroting the same line. Do the right thing. Let them stay. The tone was eerily familiar. My lawyer skimmed them and shook his head. All her handwriting different names. She's losing her grip. But obsession is unpredictable. One evening, after a long day finishing the chimney cap, I saw her car again at the bend. She didn't get out, just sat there, engine idling, watching. I stood at the gate, arms crossed, letting her know I saw her. We stared at each other across the distance, rain dripping from the branches, until finally she backed down the road. The hairs on my neck didn't settle until long after she was gone, because I knew with the same certainty I felt in the pit of my stomach before a storm that she wasn't finished. Her last attempt had crumbled in the mud and thunder, yes. But people like Karen don't stop because they're beaten. They stop because they're forced to. And I wasn't naive enough to believe the storm at the gate was the end. It was just the beginning of the next siege. If the storm was the climax, then what followed was the courtroom, an arena far less dramatic to the eye, but infinitely more decisive. Karen hadn't slunk away after her convoy retreated. No, she doubled down. Within 2 weeks of the storm, I was served with papers by a process server who looked embarrassed to be holding them. She had filed for historic easement rights, claiming her family had generational use of the guest house and road, and therefore I was unlawfully blocking access. On top of that, she tacked on a tenancy claim on behalf of her parents, insisting they were long-standing residents displaced without cause. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, the wood still smelling of fresh varnish, reading the words and laughing, not out of joy, but out of disbelief. She had twisted her fantasy into legal language and presented it like fact. Hartley, my lawyer, was less amused. "This is her last card," he said over the phone. "If she wins even a sliver of recognition, she'll wedge it open. We're going to bury her with evidence." So we prepared. I gathered every document, the original deed, the 30-year-old survey, the notarized affidavit, the inspector's clean reports, the sheriff's written logs of harassment, and most importantly, the footage of the storm. Frame by frame, it showed her convoy stuck in the mud, her parents panicked, her screaming at the gate, the sheriff calmly confirming my ownership. Hartley smiled when he saw it. "This isn't just evidence. This is theater. Judges hate circus acts, and she's given us the perfect reel." The hearing was set for a Tuesday morning at the county courthouse. I drove down the mountain, early binder, heavy in my arms, my stomach a knot of tension and anticipation. When I walked into the courtroom, she was already there, parents in tow. They looked pale, weary, dressed as if they'd been dragged to church against their will. Karen, by contrast, was in full battle mode blazer, too sharp for the occasion, hair pulled back, a stack of photocopied maps and blurry photographs clutched in her hands. When the judge entered, a silver-haired woman with glasses perched low on her nose, the air shifted. Calm, stern, no nonsense. She glanced over the filings, then lifted her eyes to Karen. "You may proceed." And Karen did. For 20 minutes, she spun a tale of family legacy, ancestral rights, community traditions, emergency needs. She waved photographs of picnics by the creek, Xeroxed maps with circles scrawled in red ink, even a letter she had written herself, claiming her parents were entitled to live in the guest house by moral precedent. Her voice rose cracked, turned tremulous at just the right moments. She painted herself as a daughter fighting for her frail parents against a cold-hearted stranger. I sat there, binder unopened, letting her dig her hole. When she finished, the judge turned to Hartley. "Your response." Hartley stood, adjusted his tie, and calmly laid our evidence on the bench like bricks in a wall. First the deed signed, sealed, notarized, stretching back decades. Then the surveyor's affidavit, stating the road and gate were private, with no easements. Then the inspector's reports, clean, official, dated. Then the sheriff's harassment logs detailing complaint after complaint. And finally the video. The judge watched silently as the footage played the storm, the U-Haul Karen screaming, her parents clearly distressed, the sheriff stating flatly that the property was mine. The courtroom was silent except for the thunder on the recording. When it ended, Hartley spoke just 4 words, res ipsa loquitur, the thing speaks for itself. The judge nodded slowly, then looked at Karen. Do you have any legal documentation supporting your claims? Karen stammered, flipping through her photocopies, holding up the old photographs again, as if they might magically transform into deeds. This shows... The judge cut her off. Photographs of family picnics are not legal documents. Community traditions are not binding law. This property is owned outright by the respondent. The road and guest house are his. There are no easements, no tenancy rights, and no legal grounds for your petition. Her gavel came down with a sharp crack. Petition denied. It felt like thunder again, but this time it was victory. Karen's parents looked stricken, as if only in that moment had they realized how far she had dragged them. Her father leaned toward her, whispering urgently, but she sat frozen jaw, tight eyes burning holes into the bench. Before the session ended, Hartley handed the clerk another set of papers, a formal injunction against harassment. The judge reviewed it, nodded, and signed without hesitation. Within minutes, Karen was legally barred from contacting me, from filing false complaints, from approaching my gate without legitimate cause. Walking out of that courtroom, the binder heavy under my arm, I felt an exhaustion I hadn't even known I was carrying. Months of noise, threats, storms, and manipulation all shut down with the thud of a gavel. But even in victory, there was no gloating. I didn't want her destroyed. I just wanted my peace back. That night, back on the porch, I sat with a mug of coffee, watching the stars prick the sky above the ridge. The air was sharp, the creek murmured below, and for the first time since buying the house, I let myself imagine a future without constant siege. The injunction meant the sheriff could act immediately if she trespassed again. The court ruling meant no more petitions, no more fake bylaws, no more letters disguised as law. Still, the mountain had taught me not to underestimate her. And sure enough, a few days later, her car appeared once more at the bend. She didn't get out, didn't shout, just sat there in the dusk, headlights off, engine idling. A defeated general surveying a battlefield she could no longer cross. After a long minute, she rolled away. Her parents, a week later, sent me a handwritten note. Shaky script full of apology. We did not know the truth. We are sorry for the trouble. Thank you for not pressing charges during the storm. I read it twice, folded it neatly, and filed it in the Karen Chronicles, the final entry perhaps, or at least a coda. The sheriff stopped by handing me the official copy of the injunction. I've rarely seen someone handle this much harassment with so much patience, he said. We stood side by side, looking down at the locked gate, glinting in the late sun, 2 men drinking coffee in silence. The house, the mountain, the gate, they were mine again. And for the first time, it felt like enough. Winter came to the ridge, not with a blizzard, but with a hush. Snow dusted the branches, muffling every sound, until even the creek below was reduced to a low, constant hum under ice. The mountain, once a stage for Karen's theatrics, settled into stillness. And for the first time in months, I felt the weight begin to lift. The injunction worked like a charm. The courthouse filing had been more than ink. It was a wall she couldn't climb. No more fake HOA letters, no more ambushes at the gate, no more convoys with her parents in tow. Even the county clerk called to tell me, half joking, that their office had been quieter since her petition stopped. The silence was so complete it almost felt unnatural. But the habits of siege don't vanish overnight. For weeks, I still checked the cameras before pouring coffee, half expecting headlights to creep up the road. I still walked the perimeter at night, with a flashlight scanning the tree line for signs of her presence. And I still flinched when the phone buzzed, bracing for another complaint that never came. Slowly, though, the mountain taught me to let go. The deer returned, pawing through the snow under the apple trees. Hawks circled lazily over the ridge. Even the mail carrier, once hesitant to drive up, stopped to chat one morning, telling me the community was finally getting tired of Karen's stories. In town, people began to approach me with nods of recognition. So, you're the guy with the mountain house. Heard you stood your ground. Their tone wasn't suspicious anymore, it was respectful. The house itself mirrored that shift. With the guest house finished, the wood stove crackling, and the chimney drafting clean, for the first time in decades, the place felt alive. Friends came up on weekends, marveling at the transformation. They ran their hands along the polished banisters, admired the new stone fireplace, laughed at the absurdity of my war stories. More than once someone joked about renting the guest house on Airbnb, but I always shook my head. Not yet, maybe not ever. This place had been fought for, earned nail by nail, and I wasn't ready to hand over the keys, not even for a weekend. Still, the idea of opening it up in the future lingered. A retreat for people who needed solitude, who wanted the quiet the mountain offered. Maybe one day. But for now the gate stayed locked, not out of paranoia but as a symbol. It wasn't a barricade anymore, it was a marker, a line drawn and defended. Karen, as far as I knew, licked her wounds somewhere down in the valley. The only time I saw her again was one dusk in early winter. Her car idled at the bend for a few minutes, headlights, dim engine low. She never got out, never shouted, just sat there watching before rolling away. A defeated general surveying a battlefield she no longer commanded. Her parents, in contrast, surprised me. They sent another letter, handwritten, careful, apologetic. They said they hadn't known the truth, that they regretted letting her drag them into the storm, that they hoped I'd forgive the intrusion. I read it twice, then tucked it into my binder of documents. The final entry in the Karen Chronicles. A strange human note to end a saga of entitlement. By spring the mountain had fully shed its scars. Snow melted from the slopes, birds returned, and the creek sang again. With each thaw, my vigilance thawed too. I no longer felt the need to check the cameras every morning. The gate still stood solid at the bottom of the road, but it gleamed now in the sunlight, less a fortress and more a sentinel. A reminder, not a defense. I started writing again, not logs of harassment, but essays. Notes about boundaries, about ownership, about the strange ways entitlement tests the human spirit. I wrote about how easy it would have been to snap to fight her with rage instead of patience, and how that would have handed her exactly what she wanted. I wrote about the sheriff, steady as bedrock, reminding me to document, don't retaliate. I wrote about how in the end it wasn't steel or locks or even the law that held the line, it was resolve. And somewhere along the way the house itself became the rebuttal. Each board nailed down each stone, laid each coat of paint, it all stood as proof that persistence, not entitlement, shapes the future. One night, near the end of winter, I sat on the balcony with a blanket around my shoulders, coffee steaming in my hands. Below the valley twinkled with the faint lights of town. Above the stars stretched sharp and endless. I thought about Karen, how she was probably somewhere down there telling her story to someone new, painting herself as the victim. And I realized it didn't matter. Words are cheap, deeds aren't. The facts were here in timber and stone, in the glow of my windows against the snow. The house itself was the answer to every accusation, every lie. The mountain, once a battlefield, was quiet again. And this time I knew the quiet would last. If this saga taught me anything, it's that boundaries matter, not just on deeds and surveys, but in life. People will test them. Some will push with persistence, others with guilt, and a few with outright delusion. But if you know the truth, if you've earned what's yours, the line will hold so long as you do. Karen wanted me to fight with anger. Instead, I fought with patience, with documents, with resolve. And in the end, the law sided with fact, not fantasy. Her empire of entitlement collapsed, not because I shouted louder, but because I stood steady while she spun herself into knots. To anyone watching, protect what's yours. Defend your peace. And when storms come, whether made of weather or of people, remember that persistence outlasts chaos. If you've ever dealt with a Karen of your own, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if you want more tales of entitlement, revenge, and hard-won peace, make sure to hit subscribe. There are plenty more HOA sagas waiting just beyond the gate.